What would you do if the person you trusted most, the one you built a life with, betrayed you in the darkest way? And what if disappearing wasn't the end, but only the beginning, because the past found a way to hunt you down? This is not just another story of betrayal. It's a journey of silence, exile, and the haunting chase of a cheating wife who refuses to let go. Stay with me because the twists ahead will leave you breathless. And if you enjoy powerful, true-to-life stories like this, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Cheating Stories 7, your home for drama, betrayal, and unforgettable revenge. Now, let's dive into today's story. I disappeared after her affair, now my cheating wife hunts me down. The first sign was small enough to ignore. A faint citrus perfume, one that didn't live in our bathroom, clung to Rachel's coat after her so-called team drinks. Its brightness lingered in the car like a rumor. Then came the guarded smiles at late-night texts, the quick tilt of her phone away from my line of sight, as if she were shielding a fragile secret from the weather. She had explanations ready, launched deadlines, a forgetful manager, a colleague who overshared, but each one demanded that I doubt what my own eyes could see. I tried. Because marriage trains you to choose trust, even when it feels like stepping onto a plank you can't quite see. On Thursday, the calendar shifted. A 2-hour workshop stretched into an evening strategy dinner, the kind of vague add-on that grows teeth if you stare at it too long. She walked out in a dress I hadn't seen in months, wearing a confidence I hadn't felt in weeks. I kissed her cheek and tasted distance. When the door clicked shut, the apartment held its breath. I held mine longer, then told myself I was only going for a drive to clear my head. The city remembered us. I followed the route we used to take on anniversaries, turn at the mural, ease past the bakery, idle at the fountain where we once argued about whether pigeons count as wildlife. I parked 2 blocks from the restaurant district and let the corridor of glass and neon decide the mood of the night. My hands were steady on the wheel. My mouth was not. Somewhere after the second exhale, I stopped lying to myself. I wasn't clearing my head. I was hunting for a reason to stop forgiving what hadn't even been confessed. Through the window of a bistro, I saw her. Rachel sat with Mark Thompson, the colleague whose name had drifted through recent arguments like a loose nail on a floorboard you keep stepping on. They sat too close for coworkers, too comfortably for strangers. He touched her wrist when the server laughed. She didn't flinch. She leaned in as if a secret were written on his lower lip. I counted the seconds between their glances, and in that silence I learned a language I never wanted to speak. When the check arrived, they didn't part. They stood together, perfectly synchronized, both reaching for coats, both smiling at something too private for the room that had fed them. Outside, the air wore the soft heat of early summer. Inside my chest, something wooden began to crack. They walked without hurry, side by side, no longer pretending to argue about taxis or trains. At the corner, a hotel spilled gold light across the sidewalk like an invitation. They crossed beneath it as if that light had always belonged to them. I stayed hidden beneath the shadow of a florist's darkened awning, watching 2 silhouettes choose a door together. I had rehearsed this moment 100 times, always failing it, storming the lobby, demanding a room number, delivering a speech that would win strangers' sympathy and earn my own regret. But the real moment was quieter and more violent. I froze. The world narrowed to the pulse in my neck and the hiss of a bus kneeling at the curb. A taxi door closed, a bellman waved, someone laughed 2 blocks away, and my marriage ended between those sounds without ever announcing itself. I did not follow them. The lobby doors opened, swallowed their shapes, and closed. That was all. I stared at my reflection in the dark glass, searching for the man this could not happen to. He wasn't there. What remained was a man who could be lied to because he had permitted convenience to masquerade as trust. I turned away before my reflection learned to pity me. Back in the car, I gripped the wheel until the leather warmed like skin. A practical list unspooled because the mind, when frightened, clings to chores, documents to capture, passwords to change, boxes to fill, a storage unit to rent. A smaller life to assemble, one that could be moved in a single trip and defended with one lock. I let the list anchor me because the alternative was a hurricane. I did not cry. I did not curse. I breathed like someone learning to survive underwater. The drive home was long in the way only familiar roads can be when they refuse to look like escape routes. Street lamps slid over the hood in slow intervals, counting me down to whatever comes after disbelief. I imagined the elevator ride she and Mark were taking, the nervous joke, the key card that works on the first try, the practiced laughter that pretends this is courage and not appetite. I hated how easily I could imagine those details. Worse, I hated knowing that imagination always follows probability, not hope. At a red light, I looked at my hand on the gear shift. The ring that once meant everything was now only metal obeying its shape. When metal meets skin, it warms. When a promise meets a lie, it cools. I slid the ring into my palm and closed my fist, not as ceremony but as housekeeping. By the time I reached our building, resolve stood in the doorway of my mind without asking permission. Tomorrow would not be a courtroom. Tomorrow would be logistics. I would move the life out of this life before Rachel even knew it had hollowed. No speeches, no last appeals, no bargaining with a future built on yesterday's fracture. The hall smelled of lemon cleaner and someone else's dinner, ordinary aromas that felt like mercy. I unlocked the apartment, turned on the kitchen light, and set the ring on the table. It steadied itself in the silence. I pulled a legal pad from the drawer and wrote a list with square, tidy letters that did not belong to a man in crisis: bank, cloud, lease, storage, keys. The pen moved as if it had been waiting for this moment all along. I left the pad beside the ring, switched off the light, and stood in the doorway listening to the refrigerator hum. It sounded like an engine already running. I knew then I was already gone. Rachel's flight left on a Thursday afternoon. She kissed me on the cheek in that distracted way that suggested her mind was already boarding, already seated, already in some other orbit. I held the kiss as proof of absence, not intimacy. When the door latched behind her, silence spread through the apartment like a tide. I stood still long enough to feel it press against my ribs, then exhaled. Time had started. I had 2 days. 2 days to dismantle a life that once pretended to be permanent. Efficiency came easier than I imagined. I opened my laptop and backed up years of files, tax records, contracts, photographs digitized into safety. I closed joint subscriptions with the precision of a surgeon removing infected tissue. I checked our bank accounts one last time, relief prickling when I confirmed what I already knew. Everything had remained separate. Clean break. No court battles. No leverage left behind. I moved through rooms like a thief whose crime was reclamation. Closet doors swung open. Boxes filled. Drawers emptied. I left behind furniture, framed prints, and the half-burned candles Rachel had always favored. What I carried out was mine alone, my work gear, 2 duffels of clothes, and a shoebox of photographs I refused to let her erase by omission. On the kitchen table, I placed my ring. Next to it, a note written with deliberate brevity: "You made your choice. Now I am making mine. No preamble, no poetry, just a severing." I stood over the words for a long time, the way a builder inspects the final nail, then turned off the light. The drive out of the city was almost dreamlike. Concrete gave way to fields, neon to darkness, traffic to a lonely stretch of road lined with unspoken promises. I headed toward land I had bought years ago, a contingency Rachel once mocked as a foolish bachelor's bunker. Tonight it was prophecy. At the edge of that property, a friend waited with keys to an old trailer. The smell of sawdust hit me first, sharp and clean, the scent of things stripped back to beginnings. Inside was modest, a narrow bed, a table, space for a desk. It was enough. Internet service reached me here, tethering me to work. The sky stretched wide above, reminding me that freedom is measured not by how much you own, but by how far you can look. I did not text anyone. I let my phone go dark, each unread message dissolving into irrelevance. Rachel would return to an emptied apartment and invent her own narrative. I had no intention of auditioning for a role in that play. At dusk, I stepped outside. Crickets stitched their map across the field. Fireflies blinked like brief affirmations. I waited for grief to roar, to bend me double, to punish me for daring to leave quietly. But it came differently, not as thunder, but as a faint lightness at the back of my tongue, the aftertaste of something bitter finally spat out. And in that silence, exile did not feel like punishment. It felt like freedom, fragile but undeniable. The weeks widened into something like a second language, a rhythm I hadn't spoken since childhood summers. Country mornings introduced themselves slowly, the hiss of the kettle, coffee ground by hand, steam curling toward the open window while emails carried themselves across time zones. Sparrows landed on the fence as if auditioning for my attention, small punctuation marks in otherwise silent days. Code reviews and bug fixes fit neatly between their flights. My job traveled with me. My fear did too. I had expected collapse. I thought loneliness would arrive like a landslide, loud, choking, final. But the collapse never came. Instead, silence unrolled itself across the hours like a carpet, and I walked it without stumbling. There was space here, space to see myself clearly. Twilight brought runs on dirt roads, sweat carrying the remnants of anger into the dust. Evenings were quieter still, just the creak of the trailer settling, and the steady hum of crickets rehearsing their endless chorus. I began to fix things. The latch on the trailer door that always stuck, the hinge on the small cabinet, the habit of drinking coffee too quickly. Each repair was small, but together they built a scaffolding of order. I bought a folding desk from a second-hand shop and set it up beside the window. On it, I placed a lamp, a notepad, and a smooth river stone I had pocketed during one of my hikes. 3 objects, deliberately chosen as though I were constructing an altar to a life that asked only for steadiness. It wasn't joy. I didn't call it that. It was something quieter, the clear air after a storm when you step outside expecting to smell destruction but instead find the grass rinsed and upright. I spoke to almost no one, the cashier at the market, the man who sold me firewood, a passing hello to a runner on the trail. The silence was not punishment, it was choice. A door I kept closed until my heartbeat found its new rhythm. On an index card taped to the wall above my desk, I wrote rules in block letters. Tell the truth early, leave before contempt grows, choose the ordinary over the dramatic. Never abandon yourself to preserve a story. They were not promises to anyone else. They were reminders to myself, the scaffolding for days that might otherwise crumble. At night, sleep carried me into inventories, dreams where I unpacked boxes, decided what to keep and what to burn. I would wake with the weight of objects in my hands, books, her jewelry, our photographs, then realize the objects were never there. They belonged to another life when I refused to live again. I did not search Rachel's name online. I didn't scan for updates, gossip, or drama. Outrage once tempted me, but now I saw it for what it was. A theater built to keep the betrayed sitting in the dark, watching the same scene repeat itself. I had walked out of that theater. I wasn't going back. Revenge, if I had to call it that, wasn't loud or cinematic. It was the quiet work of building a life that answered only to me. A life not choreographed around someone else's appetites or apologies. Sometimes trauma arranged my body into wakefulness at 3 a.m., adrenaline rising like a false alarm. In those moments, I didn't reach for my phone. I didn't compose messages that daylight would regret. Instead, I breathed, slow, deliberate, until the panic settled, until my pulse quieted enough to remind me. This exile was also my freedom. The grocery run was supposed to be nothing. Just a carton of milk, a bag of rice, maybe the indulgence of fresh bread from the town bakery. I kept my head down, sunglasses on even in the shade, convinced that anonymity could be maintained by posture alone. I was pushing my cart toward the register when a familiar voice stopped me mid-stride. "David!" I froze. Sophie Grant stood only a few feet away, holding a basket of apples. She had always been Rachel's friend first, but Sophie carried kindness in every movement, practical, not sentimental. Her surprise softened quickly into caution. She leaned closer, lowering her voice. "I won't tell her I saw you." The words landed like a confession, as if she had anticipated my fear before I even admitted it. Relief hit me so sharply it almost hurt. But Sophie didn't stop there. She carried news the way some people carry burdens, eager to set them down. "It didn't stay quiet, David. The affair, it wasn't just gossip, it blew up. A rumor turned into whispers, and then came the HR meetings." I kept my eyes fixed on the linoleum floor. Still, Sophie went on, voice hushed but relentless. "Mark got shuffled into another department, looked like a demotion without the paperwork. Rachel, she didn't last long after. Weeks of side eyes, colleagues cutting her off mid-sentence, meetings that felt like trials. She resigned, said she was leaving on her own terms, but everyone knew better." Sophie hesitated, then added, "Mark's fiancé found out everything. It got ugly. Rachel told her the whole truth in some grand gesture, but all it did was torch the ground under everyone's feet." I lifted my hand, palm outward. "That's enough." The firmness in my voice startled even me. Not sharp, not cruel, just final. I wasn't glowing with satisfaction at Rachel's downfall, and I wasn't rushing to cradle her in pity either. The consequences weren't mine to manage. Choices carry themselves like whether you live beneath the storm you summon. We stood in the checkout line in silence after that. Sophie gave a small nod as if she understood, then paid for her apples and left me to my milk and rice. On the drive back, I thought about how easily I could have swallowed the gossip like sugar, letting it dissolve on my tongue until bitterness seemed sweet. But I didn't. I let her words fall away at the county line. My life wasn't in that office anymore. It wasn't in the ruins Rachel had built. Back at the trailer, I brewed coffee and opened my laptop. The lamp glowed, code compiled, the world stayed intact, and my chest felt steadier. That was the moment I realized something I never would have believed months earlier. Not tracking your ex wasn't just discipline. It was practice, daily, deliberate. A refusal to let yesterday write tomorrow's sentences. The tourist town was meant to be anonymous. A strip of craft shops, ice cream parlors, and a cafe where the Wi-Fi never collapsed under the weight of vacationers posting photographs. I went there because anonymity was built into the bustle. I could sit for hours, headphones in, a man at a laptop indistinguishable from a dozen others doing the same. That afternoon, I parked on a shaded side street and walked toward the cafe's glass door. I had already rehearsed my order, dark roast, black, nothing else. The barista never asked questions, and I valued her for that. But the bell above the door betrayed me. By the window, angled toward the street, sat Rachel. She wasn't scanning the room. She wasn't waiting for anyone. She was scrolling her phone, shoulders bent slightly forward, posture I recognized as easily as my own reflection. For a split second, memory overpowered reality. Mornings when I would come up behind her, kiss the curve of her neck, complain she'd be late for work. But this wasn't memory. This was presence, and it was too close. The air in my chest collapsed. Coincidence, my mind tried to argue. She could be passing through, meeting someone else here for reasons that had nothing to do with me. But the coincidence was too large. I didn't let myself think further. I stepped back, letting the bell chime again as if I were just another customer deciding against caffeine. I slipped down the side street, moving faster with each block until adrenaline, not logic, was steering my feet. By the time I reached my truck, my hands trembled against the steering wheel. I wasn't angry the way I had once imagined anger would feel. It wasn't dignified or righteous. It was raw, animal fear. The kind you feel when a predator turns its eyes toward you. I had ghosted her to disappear. Yet here she was, breathing the same air, close enough that a turn of her head could undo the year I had built from silence. That evening in the trailer, I tried to rationalize it. I wrote a list of explanations as if logic could steady my pulse. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe she had a friend nearby. Maybe the town was smaller than I believed and luck had betrayed me. But my body had already decided, and the body believes before the brain does. I checked the locks I had already checked. I shut curtains I normally left half open. I promised myself that next time I needed groceries or coffee, I would choose another town, another cafe, another hour. That night I dreamed of endless hallways lined with doors that refused to latch. Every handle I touched gave way. Sleep offered no sanctuary. At dawn, I laced my running shoes tighter than usual and hit the dirt road. I ran until my lungs burned, farther than I had in weeks, the horizon refusing to shrink. And I did not look back, not once. The next weekend, routine betrayed me. I told myself I could return to town if I staggered my errands, different hours, different routes. But habit is a quiet animal, always waiting to be fed. By late morning, my arms were full of groceries, laptop balanced precariously, the hum of a completed coffee order still warm in my chest. I stepped out of the cafe into the wide, noisy street. And then it came. David! The name tore through the air like a flare. I turned before I could stop myself because bodies obey names even when minds refuse. Across the street stood Rachel. Her voice carried over traffic, her face shifting into a mixture of apology and wonder. She was already moving toward me, weaving through cars with the urgency of someone who had rehearsed this moment. My feet did not move. My arms, heavy with bags, shifted just enough so that my palms opened outward, a barricade without violence. She slowed at the sight of it. Her performance faltered for a breath, then recovered. Just a few minutes, she pleaded, her voice smaller now that she stood closer. I scanned the street, too exposed, too vulnerable. With a nod toward the park benches a block away, I redirected her, keeping the encounter public, visible. We sat beneath the awning of a closed shop, the distance between us filled with afternoon light. Rachel tried first for familiarity. You look different, stronger, the beard suits you. She spoke casually, but her eyes betrayed something else, a tremor not entirely strategy. I let her words fall. Compliments weren't bridges, they were bait. She began her confession, halting at first, then gathering speed. I didn't mean for it to happen. The office consumed me. Mark, he wasn't love. He was an exit sign. I thought I was walking out of fire, but the door only led to another burning room. I listened, steady, without nodding, without shaking my head. I allowed 3 facts to settle like stones between us. She lied. I left. We are divorced. Nothing, she said, could move the gravity of those truths. Finally, she asked the question that made my jaw tighten. Can I see where you live now, just to talk longer away from all this noise? No. The word left my mouth low, even unyielding. It wasn't designed to be tested. Her face pinched, then smoothed. She inhaled as if to argue, then exhaled as if recognizing futility. For a long moment, we sat in the silence of what could no longer be negotiated. The conversation didn't end in agreement, apology, or forgiveness. It ended in boundary, a stake hammered into dry ground. I rose first, lifting my groceries, reclaiming my laptop. I nodded once, not as farewell, but as punctuation. Then I turned down the street, feeling her gaze follow until it dissolved into the crowd. With each block I walked faster, the word no echoing in my chest. Not weakness, but the only strength I had left. We agreed to meet in the afternoon when the town was crowded enough to feel safe, but not so noisy that our voices would vanish. I arrived first, taking the outer seat of a bench near the fountain, back straight, hands folded in my lap. It wasn't trust that brought me there. It was curiosity, tempered by vigilance, the kind you use when approaching a wild animal you once believed was tame. Rachel appeared minutes later, dressed as if she had stepped straight out of a memory. White shorts, a ponytail pulled tight just the way she wore it on our weekend hikes, and the faint trace of perfume I recognized instantly, the duty-free bottle I'd once bought her in an airport back when small luxuries felt like promises. The familiarity hit me hard, but I held still. Nostalgia would not dictate my pulse. She sat down with a careful smile, the kind that asked for permission before it asked for forgiveness. Words spilled quickly about guilt, about the office politics that had chewed her up, about Mark's punishment, about the mess she had created when she retaliated by telling his fiancé everything. She didn't glamorize it. She painted it raw, awkward meetings, whispered gossip, fallout that left everyone scorched. Her eyes brimmed as she spoke, and soon the tears came. They weren't fake. I knew her too well for that. But they weren't the point either. Tears, however real, could not reconstruct trust. "What do you want, Rachel?" I asked finally. "Not what you feel, what do you want?" She inhaled shakily, then delivered her script. A second chance, a clean slate to start over. Her voice trembled, but the words were polished, rehearsed desperation disguised as sincerity. My answer was already waiting for her. It had been waiting since the night outside the hotel. "You ended it when you crossed the line." She broke then, sobs rushing out, shoulders heaving, face hidden in her hands. People passing glanced over, some slowing, some politely looking away. Public pain always draws an audience. I sat still, acutely aware of how easily our lives could become spectacle. After a moment, I reached out, not to offer absolution, but to steady the storm. I let her cry against my shoulder briefly, a gesture not of reunion, but of humanity. I wasn't trying to destroy her. I was trying not to be destroyed again. When her sobs subsided into trembling breaths, we rose and walked slowly down the block. I asked the question that still gnawed at me. "How did you find me?" Her answer came too quickly to be fabricated. Linda Harris mentioned you were out here somewhere. That was all, just a slip, but I couldn't let it go. I came again and again, hoping I'd see you." I exhaled, half angry, half resigned. Coincidence had been weaponized into pursuit. We stopped at the corner. I nodded once, stepping back to redraw the boundary I had already spoken. Rachel lingered in the sunlight, hands clasped as if she were still holding onto a chance that wasn't there. I turned away, the sentence echoing behind me like iron. "You ended it when you crossed the line." We settled on dinner because daylight had proven survivable, and I wanted rules written into the choice. My voice was steady, almost businesslike. Public patio, 1 hour, no alcohol. Rachel agreed too quickly, as if terrified the conditions might vanish if she hesitated. The patio overlooked a narrow street where string lights hung like borrowed stars. Other couples leaned close across their tables, whispering, laughing. Rachel and I sat opposite one another like diplomats from estranged countries. She spoke first. Words tumbled into the space between us, heavy with remorse. She described the months after I left, her job disintegrating, colleagues' eyes hardening, Mark's anger when the affair collapsed. "I didn't realize how much I hated myself until it was all gone," she whispered. "Every morning felt like punishment." I listened, but I did not correct her retellings. I noticed how memory polished its edges in her mouth, how she framed her betrayal as if it were an accident of gravity, a fall no one could stop. I knew better. But arguing with her version meant staying inside her narrative, and I had already left that stage. "I'm not here to dispute history," I said finally. "I'm here to make boundaries clear." She looked up, startled, mascara smudged, but eyes sharp. "You won't know where I live. You won't have my number. If we speak, it will be through a new email. That's all." Rachel bristled at the formality, then shifted quickly into pleading. "David, please, I've changed. I just want a chance. I need you to see it." Her voice cracked, then softened into the posture of charm she had used so often before, but I didn't punish her by enjoying her discomfort. I held the line. "The trust is gone," I told her. "The person I loved isn't sitting here, or maybe she always was, and I can only see it now." The words landed like stones across the table. Rachel dropped her gaze, twisting her napkin until it frayed. When she asked if we could meet again, I didn't give the sharp refusal she expected. Instead, I gave ambiguity, a silence dressed as possibility. But it was truth in disguise, a no wrapped in quiet. Later that night, I laced up my shoes and ran beneath a field of stars. I pushed myself harder than usual, lungs burning, legs pounding against the earth, as though exhaustion could scrub the last fragments of temptation from my body. By the time I returned to the trailer, sweat cooling on my skin, I finally slept beside the silence. It arrived on a Wednesday just before noon. The subject line was plain, from Rachel. No greeting, no lure, just her name. The email sprawled for pages, long enough to feel like a chapter rehearsed too many nights in her head. I hesitated before opening it, but curiosity finally won. She began with guilt, tracing its shape as if it were a scar she needed me to see. Guilt had hardened into self-loathing, she wrote, poisoning mornings and stretching nights into vigils. Resigning from her job, she admitted, had been less choice than exile. They didn't fire me, she typed, but I couldn't stand to breathe in a place where every whisper carried my name. She confessed therapy, though late, sessions where she spoke about emptiness, trying to thread together accountability and grief. Then came the pivot, her attempt at transformation, the cheater claiming faithfulness born of absence. Since you left, there has been no one, she insisted. I can't even imagine wanting anyone else. Every morning I reach for the other side of the bed, always shocked by the flatness of the sheets. I want to rent a small place near you to show you in simple, ordinary acts that trust can be earned back. Let me prove myself. Not in words, but in meals cooked, in weekends spent quietly and being exactly where I say I'll be. I read it twice, once as the man who had loved her, aching at her loss, once as the man who had left her, immune to the gravity she tried to summon. Both readings ended at the same closed door. I opened a blank reply and let the cursor blink. My first draft was sharp, cutting with all the words I had once screamed in silence. I deleted it. The second was too kind, dangerously close to rescue. I deleted that too. By the third attempt, clarity emerged. Thank you for the honesty. No to reconciliation. Email only. Please respect the boundary. I didn't send it that night. I closed the laptop and let the unsent reply rest, the way one leaves a bandage in place to see if the wound still bleeds. Sleep was restless, filled with fragments of memory threading into dreams, but morning came with clean light across my desk. I brewed coffee, read the reply one more time, and pressed send. My hand didn't shake. My chest didn't cave. I did not flinch. Her reply came sooner than I expected, as if she had been waiting at the edge of her inbox for my rejection. But the tone was different this time, less confessional, more strategic. Rachel wasn't pleading now, she was proposing. She wrote that she had accepted a job offer several states away, a position that would allow her to start over somewhere fresh. And in that new geography, she imagined me beside her. Your job is remote, she reminded me, underlining the words as though I needed convincing. We could choose a city that belongs to neither of us. No ghosts, no history, just us beginning again. Attached were links, rental listings in mid-sized cities, photographs of coffee shops with exposed brick jogging trails along rivers she had never walked but already described as ours. She painted the new world in bright colors, as if apartments and sidewalks could wash away the stains of betrayal. The email read like a real estate brochure for redemption. I recognized the seduction of it immediately. A new address, a new skyline, a narrative reset. It was the oldest lie humans tell themselves, that geography can rewire memory, that distance can cancel damage. I closed the laptop and stepped outside, unwilling to let her fantasy dictate my air. I walked the fence line at dusk, boots scuffing against dry earth, the horizon streaked with the final red of the sun. I asked myself the questions she hadn't. Would I ever sleep without suspicion? Would I ever trust a phone left face down on a counter? Would every late meeting sound like footsteps back into that same hotel? Each question landed heavy in the open air, and the field received them without judgment. By the time the stars emerged, my chest had already shaped the answer. I returned to my desk, opened a blank email, and typed slowly. Thank you for the offer. No to the city. No to the brochure. No to the fantasy that distance can do the work of forgiveness. The words were calm, almost gentle, but every letter was iron. I pressed send before compromise could tempt me. The discipline I had cultivated in solitude, the daily choice not to look back, was the same discipline I carried into this moment. And that night, I understood the quiet power of a calm no. We met one last time before she was due to travel for interviews, in a small cafe that smelled of cinnamon and overworked espresso machines. The sun slanted low through the windows, throwing long shadows across the floor. I chose a seat near the door, my exit line always clear. Rachel looked tired in a way I hadn't seen before. Not just sleepless, but worn down, as if her body had grown too small to contain the weight of her own questions. She sipped her tea, then set the cup down carefully as though it might shatter if handled too quickly. Her eyes lifted to mine. "If you had been the one to cheat," she asked softly, "would you want me to forgive you?" The question hung in the air like a hook, sharp and deliberate. My lips parted, but no words came. I hesitated long enough that she rushed to fill the silence. "Yes, I would. Maybe not right away, but with time, with therapy, with rules to keep us both accountable, I'd forgive you. Because marriage is supposed to be about working through the worst, isn't it?" I nodded at the logic, but I refused the premise. I leaned back, arms folded, my voice even. "I'm not here to judge the version of you that might wake up healed someday, but I won't be the bridge that carries you there." Her eyes searched my face, desperate for cracks. I offered only a dry half-smile. "Maybe 5 to 10 years, I said, letting the words fall between us. Not a promise, just a way to close the loop. Rachel seized on it anyway. "Then I'll wait," she whispered, as though her declaration might sound noble if she believed it hard enough. But I heard it differently. Waiting wasn't devotion. Waiting could be a form of self-erasure, a life postponed for a fantasy that would never arrive. We stood. I walked her to her car, noting with detached surprise that my hands were steady, my chest unshaken. She lingered, hoping for a last look. I gave her none. Back at the trailer, I pulled out the index card pinned above my desk and wrote 3 new rules beneath the old ones. No hypotheticals as hooks. No repayment plans for pain. No romance that requires me to vanish to make room for it. I set the pen down and breathed in the quiet. For the first time in weeks, it felt like air. The cursor blinked at me like a dare. I had rewritten drafts in my head all night, but when morning came, I understood clarity could only be achieved through brevity. I opened the email window and typed each sentence clean, without ornament. "Rachel, thank you for your honesty. I will not give you my phone number. Contact, if it happens at all, should remain by email and should not expect a reply. I wish you well, but reconciliation is not possible. Please respect this boundary." I read it once only to catch typos, then pressed send. I didn't linger in the aftermath. I didn't hover as if the act could be undone. The words left my outbox and hardened into the day like metal cooling after flame. Her reply arrived within hours, long paragraphs bent beneath the weight of bargaining. She was hurt first, pleading second, and by the 3rd page, sharp with anger. Embedded in her fury was the reveal of her fuller plan. She had pictured us moving together. My remote job making me portable, her new offer making us partners in reinvention. To her, love could be engineered if logistics cooperated. I felt the old instinct rise, the urge to justify myself, to untangle every knot she tied with her words, but I ignored it. Silence was its own kind of language, and I was fluent now. I closed the laptop, laced my shoes, and ran until my lungs burned clean. When I returned, I showered, cooked a simple dinner, answered a client's ticket. Life, stubborn and unromantic, continued. Another message appeared later that evening. I didn't open it. I archived it with a click and felt no cruelty in the gesture. Some chapters don't end on their own. You end them by refusing to turn another page. The weeks that followed were quieter on the surface, but grief has a way of sneaking back through unguarded doors. A playlist shuffled into an old song we once claimed as ours, and for a moment nostalgia tugged at me like a tide. A quiet Sunday morning stretched long and empty, trying to rename itself as loneliness. Even memory, sly and insistent, sometimes dressed itself up as proof, whispering that maybe I had made a mistake by closing the door for good. I caught myself in those moments. I refused to let shadows of the past author my present. Instead, I leaned into the invitations of the life I had begun to rebuild. The hiking group I had joined called me out for weekend treks, their laughter echoing across forest trails. I accepted coffee one afternoon with a woman from the town library, a soft-spoken archivist who lit up when she spoke about restoring old furniture. Our conversation was ordinary, unburdened, and therefore beautiful. One evening, standing on her porch after walking her home, I kissed her. It wasn't dramatic, not even planned. Just a kiss beneath the yellow porch light, brief but undeniably alive. I didn't apologize for it, not to her, not to myself. I wasn't reckless with this new chapter. I became precise about what my life contained. Meals cooked for one, sometimes for two. Projects started and finished without interruption. Days that belonged to themselves, not to the chance of an old door opening again. Temptation, I realized, wasn't only Rachel's pull. It was also the lure of clinging to a narrative where nobility meant continuing to suffer, a martyr polishing pain into identity. I looked temptation in the eye, and I let it go. I decided not to be noble. I decided to be well. For a while, her messages kept arriving, each one wearing a different mask. One came pleading, another casual, a third cheerful, as if by trying enough keys one might unlock the door again. I didn't answer. Eventually, the notes grew shorter, then less frequent, until the inbox went still. Silence did not arrive like a void. It settled like a presence carrying its own weight. At first, I waited for it to mean something. Would silence signal surrender? Was it a tactic, a pause before another push? But the longer it stretched, the more I realized it required no translation. Silence was simply itself. I stopped interrogating it for omens. I began living alongside it the way one lives with weather, acknowledging its presence without asking it for prophecy. One afternoon, I pulled down a box from the top shelf of the closet. Inside were the last artifacts I had allowed myself to keep. A scarf Rachel once wore on a cold night by the river, a photograph from a summer that had once felt true. I didn't throw them away. Instead, I placed them in storage. Not everything needed to be annihilated to be over. Some things could rest quietly out of reach, stripped of power by distance. Later, I sat at my desk and deleted her email thread. Before doing so, I exported the attachments that might matter someday in a legal sense, a precaution more than a desire. Then, with one click, the thread vanished. No farewell manifesto, no dramatic punctuation, just a line drawn across the digital page. In the field behind my trailer, I planted 3 young saplings along the fence line. When the first storm rolled through, I went out into the rain to check their stakes, pressing the soil firm with the heel of my hand. Pride welled up inside me, not complicated, not bittersweet, just pride in something that would outlast the moment. One morning, utterly ordinary, I brewed my coffee strong and plain. I stepped outside barefoot, noticing dew silvering the weeds. I stretched, breathed deep, and realized I hadn't rehearsed an argument in my head for days. No imaginary debates, no phantom defenses. The revenge that had once glinted sharp inside me had dulled into something far better. A life so uninterested in the past that, slowly, the past seemed to lose interest in me. The drawer beside my bed had always been a catch-all, spare pens, old receipts, and the index cards where I carved my private commandments. On a quiet morning, sunlight flattening across the desk, I wrote a new one. This card wasn't about Rachel. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't even about survival. It was about myself, about whoever might someday sit across a table from me with trust in their eyes. The rules were plain, the kind you don't decorate because they don't need it. Tell the truth early. Leave before contempt grows. Choose the ordinary over the dramatic. Never abandon yourself to preserve a story. I taped the card inside the drawer I opened every morning, a promise I would face before the day had a chance to tangle itself in ghosts. Then I began to act on the small, steady choices that shape a future. I scheduled a trip to see my father, who had waited patiently through the long silence of my exile. I upgraded my laptop, not as indulgence, but as investment in the work that now paid for my freedom. I returned to the field and replanted one sapling that hadn't survived the storm, pressing the soil firm with the heel of my hand. And on impulse, I signed up to teach an intro coding class at the community center, not just to share skill, but to share steadiness earned through collapse. None of it was cinematic, no orchestral score, no swelling finale, but all of it was decisive, and that was enough. When Rachel came to mind now, it wasn't a tug or a wound reopening. It was only a weather report for a place I no longer lived. I didn't win by crushing her. I won by refusing to keep living inside the wreckage she left behind. The final line on the index card read, Build a life that does not require an audience to count as real. I closed the drawer, brewed my coffee, and began my day. And so this is how David's story ends, not with dramatic confrontation, but with a choice. A choice to reclaim his life, to build new rules, and to refuse to live inside the ruins of betrayal. Rachel's shadow may have followed him, but in the end, silence and boundaries spoke louder than her pleas. What about you? If you were in David's place, would you give someone like Rachel a second chance? Or would you walk away forever? Let me know what you think in the comments below. I read every single one. And don't forget, if you want more stories of betrayal, drama, and revenge, make sure to like this video, subscribe, and join us here at Cheating Stories 7 for the next unforgettable story.